Mallorca is almost paradise. Bright golden sun, floral breeze, and cloudless skies. I had a steamy bottle of San Miguel in front of me as I basked in the shade of a potted palm tree, reminiscing about the last 3 miserable years. I can't even tell you what was more painful, the loss of my marriage or the tragic plane crash that followed. Anyway, both events were tied together by one man, Colonel David Osborne, or as I affectionately called him, the asshole. The asshole moved up the career ladder by licking the right butts. Therefore, he believed all that was required were the 2 Bs, combativeness and bravado. He had them in abundance, as well as the other 2 Bs, bluff and nonsense. This ultimately caused its collapse. My life and happiness were just collateral damage. When my story began, I was the captain of the 780th Military Intelligence Brigade. This might sound nice until you know that the main qualification for my 2 golden sleepers was a master's degree in software engineering from Carnegie Mellon. The 780th is an offensive unit, no different in concept from the Armored Corps at Fort Knox. But the people standing on the bastions in our digital age are not classic Marines with sculpted jaws. These are the guys the Marines put in lockers. And yet, ironically, they are the ones who now protect us from the unthinkable. Every country faces traditional military threats. They are all more or less serious. But armed conflicts, invasions, and very close nuclear war have existed for several decades. Cyber war is a horse of a different color. Cyber attacks can come from anywhere. They happen instantly, and their results are no less catastrophic than if someone dropped a nuclear bomb on you. Don't believe me? Well, believe me. Because if, for example, a cyber attack knocks out our electrical grid, and this is not at all impossible, we will all have the opportunity to live in the 18th century, permanently. What's worse is that it doesn't require expensive military equipment. All you need is the right know-how, and that, unfortunately, can be found in every shitty country on the planet. Therefore, the only effective way to convince a potential criminal that mass extinction would be a very bad idea is to remind him that he would be better off digging 2 graves at once. That was my job. My specialty is worms. No, not those. Earthworms are good for your lawn. I was a master at creating self-replicating malware called internet worms, and my little pets could bring a post-industrial society to its knees in a matter of minutes. That's why at Fort Meade I was considered something of a grise. I look fine, taller than most with a long face, deep-set gray eyes, and an unruly mop of dark hair. But underneath that, I'm a devout geek, and people like me don't spend much time in the real world. My interests are focused mainly in cyberspace, mainly in games. It was there that I met and even teamed up with Tiffin Ellerian in the Warcraft MMO. She was in the same alliance faction as me and was a strong human mage for my blonde paladin. I've always wondered what Tiffin looked like. Of course, there was no way I could encounter her in physical space, and I probably wouldn't have liked it. Because in the real world, my ideal woman could be anyone, from a bisexual who likes hard sex, whose legs have never been shaved, to an overweight nerd who lives in her parents' basement and gets a thrill from imagining herself as a woman. Then I worked at FanX, a complex of National Security Agency facilities. This is not a shining citadel on a hill called Fort Meade. FanX is located in Linthicum, Maryland, next to BWI, Baltimore Washington Airport, and is relatively free of plate swords, i.e., senior ranks. Therefore, there is a completely different atmosphere here. There's all sorts of stuff here, like the crypto school and a ghost ops unit like mine. But like any other establishment, they throw a Christmas party for the rabble. And since FanX has all the charm of an airport baggage area, this party usually takes place at the Marriott Hotel in Baltimore's Inner Harbor. Like I said, I'm a nerd with all the social graces of a high-end living room sofa, but the colonel with the bird, to whom I was subordinate, made it clear that my presence was mandatory. So there I was, in my dress uniform, lurking at the back of the party, trying to look interested, wishing I was in the Shadowlands or anywhere but here. It was then that I noticed a gorgeous woman sitting alone at a large round table at the end of the room. She radiated irritation and boredom. which undoubtedly explained the lack of suitors, because she was simply stunning. My botanical gift began to squeak, and I thought to myself, she may be hot, but she's one of us. A nerd can always be recognized. It's something about the way we sit on the sidelines and look down on everyone around us. So, being socially retarded myself, I decided to come over and say hello. She radiated the demand. "Don't talk to me!" Naturally, I spoke. "You seem to be as bored as I am." She studied me with a half smile, as if appraising a particularly interesting species of rodent, and said, "You're wasting your time." I pulled up a chair and said, "Can I sit down?" She made an inviting gesture. "This is a free country. Just don't expect me to talk." I sat down and said, addressing no one in particular, "Okay, then I will speak. You're here because your boss made you come. You would like to be anywhere but here because all these happy people are driving you crazy. So instead of drinking and socializing, you want to do what you usually do on a Friday night, surf the internet." I stopped and said sardonically, "How am I doing so far?" She smiled involuntarily, and I added, "I know I'm right, because that's the only reason I'm here and not in the Shadowlands, which is the place of choice for any time I'm not at work." She perked up noticeably and said, "Really? Seriously? Are you a gamer?" I extended my hand and said, "Lothar Kingslaughter, light-skinned Draenei paladin." She gasped and reflexively put her hand to her delicious breasts. Then she said excitedly, "Tiffin Ellerian, human mage." I exclaimed in shock, "My God, are you her?" She nodded readily. It was as if we were former high school sweethearts suddenly bumping into each other at our 20th high school reunion. That's the story of how a potentially painful evening turned into one of the best evenings of my life. We spent hours talking about really important things, like the strategies we used to defeat the Burning Legion's minions and our experiences in Azeroth. This may seem strange and abstruse to you, because none of what we talked about actually happened, except perhaps in our imagination. But for Tiffin and me, these events were as real as the mating dances that take place among muggles. It's just that this time, while talking, we didn't look at the monitor and didn't put on headphones as usual. Finally, I said, "Eric." She looked puzzled. I added, "My real name. Gamers have to make such explanations." She gave me a sweet smile with two charming dimples and said, "Rebecca, my name is Rebecca." This began a 14-month period of complete bliss as we got to know each other, fell in love, and got married. My wife, Rebecca, or Becky, as I affectionately called her, was nature's way of saying, "Take a bite." Anyone who believes that a beautiful and sexy woman cannot be a genius. Mathematical gifts come early, and Becky was one of those child geniuses. I have no idea what my wife's IQ was, but she graduated from Caltech with a PhD in mathematics at the tender age of 21 and worked for Central Security. That's where the real smart people are. The NSA assigned her to the cryptanalytics department, where she studied methods for breaking elliptic curve encryption. One day she tried to explain what it was. But I'm just a humble programmer, and this experience was so harrowing that I had to use our safe word to tap out, "Pineapple! Pineapple!" Suffice it to say, my wife operated on a different plane than I did. She lived in an ivory tower of theory and mathematical abstractions, even though her efforts indirectly influenced some of the worst people in the world. And in this sense, she was a real magician. Her destiny was spells and enchantments. And me? Like most paladins, my abilities are more likely to relate to brute strength. That's what programmers are like. We're not crafty, sort of the Oompa Loompas of science. However, one of my modern persistent threats, or distributed denial of service, can ruin your whole day. Like I said, brutal. If you saw my wife at a party, you wouldn't notice how weird she is. Instead, you would see an absolutely stunning woman with high cheekbones, a long, straight nose, and a wide, almost lustful mouth. She loved to laugh. Her Irish ancestors demanded it, and she loved jokes. Looking down at her beautiful face, I saw a scattering of freckles on her incredibly plump cheeks and her glowing blue eyes. Her almost transparent alabaster skin and silky shoulder-length hair black as a raven's wing, and bright red lipstick and nails created a riot of colors. Becky loved to ride her bike, and her daily 90-minute workouts on the roads gave her a slender body with incredibly muscular thighs and legs that carried her forward with a smooth, graceful gait. Despite this, my wife was a nerd through and through. Becky valued rationality and self-discipline far above sexual attractiveness. Therefore, her actions and clothes were not provocative, and she went out of her way to minimize her rich assets. This was not just about her public image, but also about how she perceived herself as a person and how she wanted others to perceive her. In many ways, Becca's denial of her own femininity was her fatal flaw. Because by nature, my wife was a deeply passionate woman, and as a result, her personality and values were constantly at war with her fundamental nature. This battle was fought deep within her psyche, like Vesuvius waiting to erupt. I have always believed that intelligence and sexual activity are interconnected. Becky was living proof of this. She loved sex the way a gourmet loves cordon bleu. She was always there for me in the moment, as if I were the only man in her universe, and her creativity and responsiveness would make you think you were John Holmes standing on the shoulders of King Kong. Despite this, Becca felt embarrassed about her diametrically opposed feelings. I partly understood her attitude. This was not a moral issue. It was a denial of her beliefs. People with Becca's intelligence level distrust instincts and despise emotions. They value rational observation and analysis. The problem is that my wife's sexual appetite did not always allow her to do this. So she was essentially afraid of her own instincts. Becky wanted people to appreciate her for her mind, not her body. And her selfless behavior during sex was an unwanted contradiction. In the end, I asked as diplomatically as I could why she, being such a holy terror in bed, never dressed or even showed the slightest hint of her eye-catching sexuality. She looked embarrassed and said, "Sex is the most illogical act I can think of. So even though I love the thrill, I just can't get over how crazy I am going. This unsettles me." Then she looked at me hesitantly, as if I might not believe what she was about to tell me, and said, "I trust you and want to give myself completely to you. So my solution is to tell myself that Tiffin is making all this noise. I'm just not participating here. Wow! It really makes sense. Each person's reality is nothing more than what your brain interprets through the five senses. It captures this data and turns it into a personal view of the world. So, in essence, your very existence is nothing more than what this soft organ in our head says. And because everyone is wired differently, we can exist in 8 billion separate universes. Becca's inner world was understandably deep and complex. And given the very imaginative virtual space we both preferred, her rationalization of her sexuality was completely valid and acceptable to me, no matter how crazy it might sound to someone else. Gamers often choose avatars that represent a different side of themselves. Well, that is, Lothar Kingslaughter is a violent, sword-wielding man, not a tall, skinny nerd. But this is how I imagine myself in virtual space, and this is how I see myself in my imagination, even if no one else sees me that way. In fact, the woman I slept with was not my shy, coldly logical wife, but Tiffin Ellerian, the hypersexual sorceress. And in Becca's mind, it was Tiffin who acted like a wild woman, not her. You may laugh, but remember that when you shout, "Drop the damn flag," you are just pixels on the screen. Or, on a personal level, virtual reality is as real to a gamer as some bad decision is to you. You're just not a player, my friend. Essentially, my wife consciously decided to be innocent, at least when it came to her relationships with men. And since both of her personalities were interchangeable in her own inventive little mind, transferring her sexual behavior to her avatar allowed her to maintain her real-world image of herself as the rational, balanced, and analytical person she had chosen to be. Of course, this schizoid compromise also made her unable to recognize when she was being sexually manipulated in the real world. It also didn't give her any practical means of defense, since she was one. As a result, Becky in her everyday persona was naive and vulnerable, like the girl next door, especially when it came to the cunning of predatory boys. But more on that later. We had everything: a good house, a wonderful neighborhood, and more importantly, a warm and cozy marital relationship. We lived in the city of Columbia, 20 minutes from Feet. They did everything together, and Becky was the best friend and companion a man could ask for. She was always carefree and happy and a pleasure to be around. She was obsessively polite, had an almost irrational fear of conflict, and never thought that others had ulterior motives. Therefore, she did not push anyone away even if they put pressure on her. I just went with the flow. On the surface, Becky was attentive and loving in a guileless, almost self-effacing way, so much so that you had no idea that such a formidable IQ was driving her interactions. In fact, most of the time, she was eager to please and was friendly like our golden retriever, warm, caring, and open to everyone. I loved her with all my heart, and our life was full of joy. We had a 12-meter yacht, Island Packet, which we sailed from CH.1 on the Chesapeake. The yacht was clearly a pamper, but we both loved sailing. It was an intellectual challenge. If you want brainless fun, buy yourself a jet ski. Getting anywhere on the wind alone requires ingenuity and seamanship. My old man put me on a sunfish boat and sent me out to Lake Huron at the tender age of 7. So I was practically born a sailor. I knew how to handle big water, and as an adult, competed in the Port Huron to Mackinac Regatta in everything from a tartan cruiser to a Great Lakes 52. They say that if you really want to experience the joy of sailing, you need to stand fully clothed in a cold shower while tearing up $100 bills. But it didn't matter to Becca or me. The hours we spent on our boat were our special time together. On weekends, we sailed the bay, sometimes as far as Cape Charles, and anchored each night in small coves, far from any shipping lanes. We enjoyed the peace and quiet of an East Coast summer evening, drinking good Cabernet and just taking in the sights, sounds, and smells of nature. Then we retired to our small cabin, where Tiffin Ilarion emerged from the Twilight Lands. Becky may be a nerd, but Tiffin has a voracious appetite, and I've always been a tasty snack. My wife was charged with sexual energy in the silvery moonlight, penetrating through the prisms of the deck. Her bright blue eyes were almost cobalt, and she was practically shaking with anticipation. I looked at her naked, slender, elastic body with steep, smooth hips, long legs, and perfectly proportioned breasts, and marveled at my luck. She said in a choked voice, "No caresses, just take me, now." It was Tiffin who spoke. Becky had never used the word take in her life. She pulled her long, beautifully sculpted legs towards her knees, and I carefully crawled between them. What followed was scratching, hitting, thrusting, a hot period of time that felt more like cage fighting than sex. Tiffin Ilarion was a warrior, and her weapon was the perfect body of my wife. She wriggled like a snake. Our sweat lubricated her. She screamed and screamed with delight. It ended with a frantic scream. She went limp just as the world ended for me, and I came like the Midnight Express, while my wife made contented gurgling sounds of unconscious pleasure. After that, I rolled onto my side and caught my breath for several long minutes. When I opened my eyes, Becky returned. She looked at me with the intense, piercing gaze she gets when she's contemplating a particularly difficult math problem. I asked worriedly, "What's the matter, baby?" She answered with tears in her eyes. "I just love you very much. I don't want to lose you," I said, still worried. "You just ate my brains out." "After such a performance, what makes you think that you will lose me?" Of course, I forgot that I am now talking to another inhabitant of my dear wife's skull. She said with all sincerity, "I just don't feel like I'm good enough for you." This statement was absurd, but self-doubt was part of the basic nature of my humble, self-sufficient, and completely crazy wife. Maybe this applies to all women? How should I know? Botanists are not known for their insight. As the old Yiddish saying goes, man proposes, but God disposes. It was my appearance on the list for promotion that brought the snake into the garden. I liked the army. She gave me a stable and predictable life. I did what I liked and was appreciated for it. I would make a lot more money in big software. But I was attracted to the service aspect, And frankly, people with my almost complete lack of social skills need to be in a highly structured environment. My work consisted of two parts. The first was to maintain our aggressive code registry. It was tabloid stuff like Stuxnet and a million other pieces of malware you've never heard of that I'd have to kill you for if you found out. The other part was detecting anomalies that help us find and destroy other people's little nasties in cyberspace. As a side project, more of a hobby, really, I've been working on a fork of my anomaly detection code. It was a heuristic AI engine that could be integrated into other applications to create human-like cognition. Or, to put it simply, I was trying to reflect people's thinking and learning in a way that created a man in a box. The number of applications of this in the real world would be endless. I'd been doing my little hobby off and on for over a dozen years, which is to say, I started 2 years before I met and married Becky. Creating the program architecture took an incredibly long time because I had to conceptualize every variable that underlies empirical thinking. In order to pay my way to nerd school at Carnegie Mellon, at age 18, I signed a contract with the Army. So, approaching my golden 20s, I was close to finishing the prototype. Further implementation would be easy. I was already starting to think that it was time for me to retire and make my little invention public. However, the difference of $20,000 a year between the half salary of a captain, which would be my pension, and that of a major, was a strong incentive for me to rise in rank first. I didn't seek or want a promotion, but when the seniority criteria for the specialty were met, I received a notification and simply got into the program. Actual promotions were in the hands of the promotion board, consisting of officers ranging from major to colonel. Everything was according to the rules. This required the usual supporting documents from the Center for Outcomes and effectiveness research, which I then handed over to a senior officer, in this case, David Osborne. Osborne was colonel of the brigade. After reading, he had to pass them along with his comments. But I never met him face to face. Everything changed at the next Christmas party. Strangely, the beginning and end of my happiness coincided with 2 Christmases a dozen years apart. Becky was a civilian at the fort and had her own party the previous weekend. For this occasion, she bought a dress that was daring for her, but she was celebrating with her fellow nerds, and the idea that she might be giving off sexual vibes didn't cross her mind. Being my practical wife, she simply reused the dress for my party. It showed off her gorgeous legs and, for the sake of variety, was shoulderless. So there was a little more cleavage. It was red, a perfect contrast to her black hair, blue eyes, and alabaster skin. To say the least, Becky was stunning, which she probably didn't expect and would be embarrassed if she found out. We walked into the Marriott ballroom and conversations literally stopped. Osborne kept a low profile with his usual collection of sycophants. Lieutenant Colonel Wysocki, Major Sharp, and a whole squad of bright-eyed, bushy-tailed junior officers. My height is 1.90 m, but Osborne was even taller, 1.95 m. I have the build of a runner, weighing 86 kilograms. Osborne was closer to 113, with big shoulders and an even bigger belly. He came from the infantry and just radiated machismo. The colonel was an impressive guy. He also mastered the steely-eyed commander's gaze to perfection, so that when he turned to look at us, he looked like an American eagle. It was an effective look, and I heard Becky take a shaky breath. This was something new. I've never heard my wife react like that to anyone before. The colonel said something to his crowd of adoring fans. Then he strode towards us, radiating military arrogance, without taking his eyes off my wife. When he approached us, we exchanged greetings and a handshake, and he said with feigned cheerfulness, "It's good that you were able to come. I had never met this man in my life, but he had a photo of me in his results and effectiveness research folder, and it was clear that Becky was the one who caught his attention." I said, "I am very pleased to be here, sir," which was a lie, but what else could I say? He said, continuing to carry on a light conversation, but looking thoughtfully at Becky, "Why don't we find some place where we can talk about your promotion?" Then he turned to Becky and said, I am sure that such a beautiful lady as you will be able to find many people to talk to while I hold your husband captive." Remarking on my wife's attractiveness was almost crossing a line. But Osborne was a brash man if he was anything. Becca's alabaster skin turned a beautiful shade of scarlet, and she said worriedly, "I'll wait here." But Osborne wanted no such thing. He called Sharp over and said sternly, "Find this magnificent creature a drink while I roast her husband." This year he is on the list. Sharp was a skinny little weasel with a bushy mustache that looked like a hedgehog, had crawled onto his lip, and died. He was clearly happy to spend at least a little time with Becky and said, "Come on, I'll introduce you to everyone." "Can I offer you a drink?" Becky said hesitantly, still looking dazed. "I'll have Chardonnay, thank you." Osborne turned to Sharp and said imperiously, "Bring the lady a drink." Then he grabbed me by the shoulder in a completely inappropriate friendly hug and led me into a side room that seemed to be intended for meetings. He started the conversation by asking me the usual questions about my background and career ambitions. He was a regular Army infantryman, and I was something completely different. So explaining what I do and where it leads was like describing cyber warfare to a pet dog. But that was not the point. He still didn't pay attention to my answers. It was clear that he was interested in my wife, because he started asking me a bunch of personal questions. How I met Becky, and what the current state of our marriage was. It seemed to me that his questions crossed all boundaries. Still, what options did I have? I could report him, but he was too high in the command chain, and they would protect him there. Besides, my future was in his hands. So I gave him vague answers, kicking myself for not turning on the recorder. He kept me in this small room for over an hour. He seemed to be stalling for time. When he finished, he said with what I read as feigned sincerity, "Well, the discussion was productive, Captain. I'm confident I can take your promotion further." We saluted each other, he turned and walked toward his group, and I headed toward the bar. After what I had just experienced, I needed to drink something strong and maybe take a shower. At that moment, Sharp reappeared, his whiskers bristling like the fur on the back of an eager Jack Russell. He said, "I spoke with the Colonel, and he wants me to brief you on what to expect in the remainder of the process." I looked at my watch and said, "It can't wait? I left my wife alone for too long." He looked at me with a blank look and said, "It will only take a few minutes, and everyone else will take care of her." If only I knew what that really meant. His few minutes turned out to be closer to 45, and in total more than 2 hours passed before I started looking for Becky. The ballroom was huge and filled with enthusiastic people celebrating. I walked around the periphery of the room, trying to find my wife. I had almost walked around the entire hall when I saw a flash of red. Becky stood with the Colonel's group and looked drunk. This was surprising for several reasons. First of all, I have never seen her drink more than 2 glasses of wine. Secondly, and more importantly, there was no way she could act like that in public. Osborne stood possessively next to her, and Becky seemed to lean against his shoulder. It didn't look intimate, as she was just trying to stay on her feet. The others fussed around them both as the great man dispensed his wisdom. His subordinates nodded approvingly. I walked through the group and walked straight up to her. Becky gave me a sentimental grin and babbled, delighted to see me. "Finally!" She was holding a full glass of wine and was clearly in the trash. I didn't understand how she got to this state, but he knew that in the morning she would be very ashamed. The last thing I wanted was to humiliate her even more by abruptly dragging her away like she was drunk. So instead, I smiled at the group and said, "Sorry guys, but we have to get up early tomorrow, so it's time for us to leave." Becky spoke in a tearful voice. "Don't be such a bore, Kitty." Now I realized that she was drunk because throughout our marriage she never called me Cat. Maybe it was Tiffin who spoke, I said to myself, giving vent to my irritation about this whole shit show. "You're not a bore, but I am, and it's already late," Osborne said in a voice impatient of disagreement. "Come on, we're just starting to have fun. You can stay for at least one more round." It was clear that this was an order, not a request. He said, "Why don't you pour yourself and your wife a drink while I escort the lady to the dance floor?" He made a sweeping bow, like something out of a 19th century film, and said, "Shall we dance, my lady?" Becky giggled drunkenly and said, "Of course, good sir." And the two of them disappeared among the swirling couples. I headed towards the bar as quickly as I could. I didn't want to leave Becky in Osborne's clutches any longer than necessary. Thoughts about promotion have long been replaced by unbridled distrust of Govnyuk and his intentions. Ivan Patterson walked with me. He was the only one in the group I knew who was a decent guy. He said carefully, "You better be careful. Osborne is after your wife. I've seen him do this before, and he rarely takes no for an answer." I said firmly, "Becky is not like that." Patterson said, "She may not be like that, but Osborne will make her like that." His henchman kept refilling her glass all night. It's an old trick called boil the frog. Never let the level get too low. It gave me goosebumps. Becky was too polite to refuse if someone offered her a refill. I said, "So that's why he was stalling." In my entire life, I've never seen Becky act like this. This must have been a planned and coordinated attempt to get her to drink. I wondered what would happen if she actually crossed the line. My wife has always been so disciplined and controlled, but I knew Tiffin Ellerian was lurking somewhere in the background. It seemed impossible that Becky would let her slip, but I've also never seen her so drunk. As I was returning with the drinks, I noticed them both on the dance floor. Osborne held both hands directly above my wife's firm ass, pulling her towards him. She had a dreamy expression on her face, her arms wrapped tightly around his neck, her chest pressed against him, and her head resting intimately on his chest. She looked lost. A hitherto unthinkable thought occurred to me. She will be his if he wants, I said out loud. "No, this won't happen. Not here." Handed the drinks to Patterson, went out onto the dance floor, and patted the colonel on the shoulder. There was a big difference in rank between us, so I had to behave politely. I said with a fake friendly smile, "Now it's my turn to dance with my wife, sir." Osborne gave me a grin and said, "Perhaps we should let the lady decide," he said softly, still rocking next to her. "Who do you want to dance with, my dear?" Without saying anything, Becky simply pressed herself closer to him. She was clearly drunk and reacted instantly, but it was a very erotic gesture. Her choice was obvious. The asshole said with a grin, "Well, I think that's your answer." Then, without saying another word, he spun her around in a dance. I stood there for ages with a broken heart. Then I realized that the entire staff of Osborne's hangers-on was watching me with undisguised glee. Their hero dominated again. It made them all feel strong and courageous. Of course, Osborne made sure that Becky was not himself before he made his move. And, more importantly, he was absolutely sure that I would end up in the punishment cell if I hit a superior officer. We had a world of uniform code of military justice, not civil law. I'm blind with rage. Some people might storm out of this place, or they might sit there and sulk. But this is the digital age, where the main predators are hackers, and IMAO, shithead, needed a harsh lesson in morals and good manners. So I decided right then and there to nuke his arrogant ass. I know this reaction doesn't make sense, but when you get angry, you do stupid things. I needed a little time to pull all the necessary levers, so I went to a secluded window alcove, scanned Osborne's smartphone, and dropped the flying monkey on him. What? Doesn't everyone have hacker malware on their phones? Now I had unlimited access to calls, SMS, photos, contacts list, even his bank account. Everything a busy person keeps on his mobile phone. Moreover, I could control its camera and recording functions. So I was in his pocket, literally. By the time I got everything ready, he and my wife had finished their dance. The asshole brought the easily controlled Becky back to the group and said cheerfully, "It was easier than I thought." One of them said, "What a weakling." He simply disappeared with his tail between his legs. Everyone present had a good laugh at this, which only strengthened my intention to go with shit to the end. He had a very bad day ahead of him. The boys joked for a long time. Then the moment came. Osborne turned to my wife and said in a falsely encouraging tone, "You don't look well, darling. Let's go up to my room and you can lie down for a minute." This made my hair stand on end. I stopped organizing the demise of asshole and began to closely monitor what was happening to Becky. She mumbled something like, "Maybe it's worth it. I have difficulty standing on my feet. I've never been so drunk." This was clearly Tiffin talking. I immediately went into alert number 1. When shit took Becky by the hand and led her into the lobby, massive fun began among the military contingent. My wife swayed slightly as she followed, but the sway of her hips showed that Tiffin was now in the house. With a sinking heart, I realized that Osborne was going to get a lot more sex than he bargained for unless I did something quickly. I didn't want to make a fool of myself by trying to get physically involved again. It was a rank issue, and I've already seen what it led to, so I needed to have leverage. I frantically hacked into the hotel's management system while sneaking behind them. It took a minute for my fluttering fingers to trigger the continuation injection needed to get the room number. At this time, I heard the elevator door ring. In the entire time it took them to walk the length of the marble hall, they did not say a word. But when the doors closed, I heard rustling and some sounds. Then my wife moaned with lust. She was clearly in heat and it just broke my heart. To be honest, I was planning on ending their little tryst before anything fatal happened. I knew all it would take to get the asshole to back down were incriminating photographs. But the hotel's keycard system was on a different server, and by the time I unlocked the door, Tiffin Ilarion was already in control. Overconfidence is the fatal flaw of a nerd, and I was getting too close to it. They were in such a hurry that they even left the light on. I hated myself. All I could see of Becca was her face, contorted in a mask of delight, and her bare arms and legs tightly closed around asshole. The room was full of wet slapping sounds and the smell of sex. She shouted, "Oh Lord! Yes! Like this! Yes!" She then appeared to lose consciousness. I recorded this entire action, but then I saw that Govnyuk had put his own phone on the bedside table and was also recording what was happening. Since it was also streamed to my cloud account, I had everything in glorious 1080p from 2 different angles. I didn't need the phone right now, so I put it on the dresser and started clapping my hands slowly. It took a second of applause because shithead was busy with my wife. However, he eventually realized that there was someone else in the room. Frightened, he rolled over onto his back and looked around. His amazement and horror were almost worth my pain. He tried to jump to his feet, but instead he caught his feet in the blanket and tumbled off my wife, landing face first next to the bed. This would be an invaluable comedy if it were not such a deep tragedy. Becky lay there, covered in sweat, legs grotesquely spread wide, in a dead sleep. It was a completely humiliating sight. The asshole, stumbling awkwardly, rose to his feet and shouted, "Give it up!" I started recording again. He realized that he was in deep trouble. I laughed and said bitterly, "I will give it to you at your Section 134 hearing." Then he added sarcastically, "Sir!" I turned on my heel, walked out the door and down the hallway to the elevator. The asshole ran into the corridor in a panic. Then I realized that he was completely naked. I turned around and captured the sight for posterity. He shouted in disappointment, "Crap!" and returned to the room. I took the elevator to the lobby and bought a beer at the hotel restaurant. Anger is a cleansing emotion. It burns away weaker ones such as indecision and self-pity. It also helps one get through impossible situations such as losing a happy life. I had a plan and began to take the steps necessary to reclaim my manhood. The first thing I did was post assholes' financial information to a few select dark web message boards. It was like throwing a delicious baby goat into a pool full of piranhas. I assumed that in the next 5 to 10 seconds, his financial situation would radically change thanks to Onion Rooter and the inhabitants of the Silk Road, an online trading platform in the zone. Onion of the anonymous Tor network. Then he sent out a short edited video to everyone on his contact list. The subject of the letter read, "Look who I'm having sex with. This should grab people's attention." I wondered what his wife and priest would think when they reproduced the investment. I used asshole's own phone number to send the message because I didn't want to be accused of an illegal revenge video. I would publish this entire terrible meeting. But due to POP3 SMTP limitations, attachments must be short. If I included the entire entry, it would be filtered out at the recipient's gateway. Luckily, there are no restrictions on what you can upload to adult websites. So I posted both posts there. I arrived late to their party. But Govnyuk's phone captured this whole wretched mess. The sex was so hot that he might even make back some of the money he's currently losing on Deep Web. I then sent a short, edited video with a carefully worded explanation to every media outlet I could think of. MSNBC, CNN, Post, Times, Fox, and One America. Revenge is not political, and this was the kind of red meat guaranteed to unleash the hounds of the Fourth Estate. The message was short and concise. It explained who Osborne was, the context of what they were seeing, and the national security implications. Finally, it warned that I expected the army to try to cover it all up. This part of the message was probably my only chance of not ending up in Leavenworth Military Prison. Now all I had left was a lonely walk to the parking lot and a long, sad drive home. I'm a nerd, and nerds don't cry. We are too rational, or perhaps weird is a better word for human emotions. But Baker's betrayal, as involuntary as it was so painful that I may have squeezed a drop or two out of myself. It was 3:15 a.m. when the first bell rang. I sat in my small home office getting things in order. It was Sharp. Without preamble, he said, "The colonel is ready to forget about your insubordination if you give him everything you wrote down. There's nothing wrong with your wife. She's just sleeping it off." I said cheerfully, "It's too late. She's already everywhere." He had no idea how everywhere it was. People unfamiliar with the cyber domain do not understand virtuality, its pervasive reach, and instantaneous time frame. These possibilities simply do not match their ideas of what is possible. Sharp, sputtering, asked, "What do you mean everywhere?" I said, "You'll see," and hung up. There might have been a final confrontation with Rebecca. That is, after she sobers up and drags her sorry ass home. But the army was ahead of her. They started knocking on my door at 4:25, and I found 3 military policemen standing on the porch. They took me to Fort McNair in the city. Not a word was said during the entire hour drive. They parked me in a small room at 3rd Division headquarters, where I was still cooling my heels at 6:30 when the 2-star guy showed up, along with Osborne, Sharp, Wysocki, and one of the captains. A fight without rules began. The guy with the 2 stars, whose name tag said mid, as in the name of the fort, said, "Stand up, soldier!" It was supposed to remind me where I am and who is in charge here. I stood at attention, and the guy walked around me, not taking his eyes off me. Finally, he said with a threat in his voice, "Do you have any idea what kind of trouble you got yourself into? Drunkenness, insubordination, and striking a senior in rank? That's all." I said in an even tone, "I deny it. Sir, my only crime was catching Colonel Osborne having sex with my wife." Osborne growled, "I told you that's what he'll say." I said, keeping my voice level and respectful, "I have half a dozen witnesses to this seduction." Osborne laughed and said, "Did you see anything, boys? They vying with each other to deny that they had seen anything at that very moment. To damn." A call came to the general's mobile phone. It was almost too unbelievable, like God ex machina, but it actually happened. The general, having gone through a series of uh-huhs, suddenly shouted shrilly, "What?" He turned to Osborne and said, "The Washington Post just contacted the Pentagon press service to ask about the cover-up of a sex scandal involving you. They say they have proof. Hallelujah. The Gray Lady of 15th Street was at it." Osborne looked like he was about to have a stroke. He turned bright red and spluttered, "Where did they get this from?" I calmly said, "I sent your post to several news organizations. I thought they might be interested." Perhaps he even mentioned that the army would try to hide it. Now it looked like they were both about to faint. Isn't revenge a bitch? The whole group, as one, turned and ran out of the room. I still had the bug on asshole's phone, so I eavesdropped on their conversation. I heard Meade say in a voice full of rage, "What the hell, Osborne? Why can't you keep it in your pants? How much do they know?" Osborne spoke as if he were being strangled. He has a recording of me and his wife. Somehow, he managed to get it to the Post. I have no idea how he did it. But he's one of the idiots in 780. The general said decisively, "Enough for me. Get out yourself. Stay away from the press until I decide what to do with you and your 3 cronies." Oh my, Shit's henchmen also seemed to be getting theirs, just like their boss. Meade added, "I'll go there now and sort everything out. In the meantime, I want you boys," he must have been addressing the military police, "to escort these 4 back to their quarters in the barracks and make sure they stay there." When the general came back in, I made a polite face. He looked gloomy as he said, "There are 2 options for the development of events. Either we make your life in the military hell, or you sign a non-disclosure agreement stating that you know nothing about anything and repeat it to the press until it's all over. In this case, you will retire with the rank of major with all the benefits." He stopped, looked at me menacingly, and added, "What do you choose?" So the gist of my sad story was that by 10 o'clock in the morning, I left Fort McNair with an active reserve contract as a retired major and a good discharge with a large government pension. I also got the impression that Meade was considering whether the Army might reintroduce flogging as a punishment for shithead. Even better, Osborne was now penniless. No matter what the Army did to him, his career was over, and his wife would file for divorce. It was a delightful topic to think about. This is what happens when you get involved with someone with my particular skill set. I would have laughed in the bastard's face, but he was confined to his home. Booah, haha. Now about the most difficult part. I had to think things through before talking to my wife. I had been running on adrenaline for a while now, and it took me a while to realize what had just happened. Thank God Becky was still passed out when the military police dropped me off at the house. I collected some of my things and left a note. It said, "It takes me a while to digest everything. Don't try to contact me until I'm ready." I even signed it, "With love," which matched my feelings. Then he jumped into his Ford F-150 pickup truck and headed to the boat. It was still only 11:30 a.m. The island packet is a cruiser, not a racer. Therefore, it looks and feels like a compact luxury apartment with all the amenities. I planned to live there all the time. Now I had nothing to do. I unpacked the things I had brought and sat on the deck, watching the happy people fly off on their weekend adventures. And then it was like I had a heart attack. It will never be me again. As a Draenei paladin, I have overcome insurmountable odds. Justice has been served, and the godless have been defeated. By all rights, I should feel very good. So why did I want to tie an anchor around my neck and jump off the transom? Because the only true jewel in my life had been desecrated, and there was no turning back. I mean, I get it, I really get it. Beneath all her nerdiness, Becky was a passionate woman, Osborne was an attractive man, and her sex with him had been a carefully planned and executed seduction on his part. However, the problem wasn't that my wife was writhing under Osborne in ecstasy. I knew that his henchmen had poured enough alcohol into her to weaken her restraint and fatally impair her sanity. The problem was the action leading up to the event, when she clung so closely to Shithead after he asked her to choose. This was the real betrayal. Every couple relies on the confidence that your other half will choose you and not someone else. This gives an innate trust in the exclusivity of your marriage. When Becky instinctively clung to Shitty, I had clear evidence that my assumptions were not entirely correct. Accordingly, while I could forgive Becky for her transgression, I simply could not accept that she chose someone else. The call came shortly after 2 o'clock. Apparently, she had finally sobered up. I replied in irritation, "Which part of the phrase, 'don't mess with me,' didn't you understand?" Some time passed, and she said with tears in her voice, "Oh God, Eric, "I am so sorry," I said as kindly as I could. "I know it's true, but that doesn't change what happened. I need time to think things through," she said, still crying. "You're on a yacht, aren't you?" "Yes, and I want to sit here and decide what I think about what just happened." "You need to stay where you are. I will return home when everything is settled and we can discuss our next steps. Until then, just stay away." She pathetically begged me. "Oh, please forgive me. I was so drunk. I know it must be terrible. I feel so achaved. You saw Tiffany doing it, not me," I said, letting anger creep into my voice. "No, my dear, it was still you. Let's stop fooling ourselves. I shouldn't have let you make this up. Tiffin is just your way of avoiding responsibility for your own actions. Now we have to live with the consequences," she said sadly. "You hate me?" "God, no. I love you with all my heart, that's the problem, but I'm not sure I can get through this. Give me a couple of days to think about it and we can talk again." She said pitifully, "I love you, and I will always love you." Unfortunately, we never talked. The problem was that Becca had top-secret S5 clearance, so when word got out that she was the woman now dominating the news cycle, she instantly became persona non grata at the fort. I should have realized this would happen when I made her little prank public, but I didn't. It was one of those split-second decisions that just seemed like a good idea at the time. Well, that is, I wanted to give the asshole a huge portion of shit, but he didn't intend to ruin Becca's life, which he did anyway, smearing her betrayal all over the internet. Admission has a lifestyle component. This is how it should be when working in national security. This is because compromising a lifestyle gives the enemy leverage, and the NSA already had too many Snowdens, Martins, and foes. As a result, Becca's security clearance was immediately revoked, and she was put on the next C-37 flight east to Iraq without any severance pay. This all happened the week after the Christmas party. My wife's disappearance allowed the NSA to rescue her from the clutches of the press, but that was not their real motive. Their real purpose was to provide an object lesson to any other nerd who might consider doing something equally stupid. Becca's transfer took effect immediately and was not subject to appeal. The only other option was prison. All this was provided for in the contract she signed, and in its effect was no different than if I had raised my right hand and taken the oath. Because the press went berserk, Becky wasn't even given the opportunity to contact me or anyone else. It was assumed that she would be able to contact me from her new duty station in the green zone. That is, after the media finds another squirrel to chase, being suddenly sent east may seem like extreme punishment. But that was nothing compared to what happened to Osborne. He was demoted 2 ranks to major and transferred to the reserve. It was especially pleasant to think that I had overtaken him in seniority in the rank of major, because I had been transferred to the reserve a few months before him. Of course, it didn't matter that Becca wasn't allowed to make contact while she was being stuffed into a box and sent away, because I've been living in a bubble all this time. My phone was turned off and I didn't look at the internet. Consequently, he had no idea what was going on in the world at large. It took a full 14 days before I was ready to talk again, but my calls kept going to voicemail. It was very painful. A merciless thought came to my mind. This little cheater is with shit. That's why I was especially shocked when 2 grim-faced civilians appeared in my life. By January standards, it was a beautiful day in the Chesapeake, sunny, with temperatures above 10, and I was now a man of leisure. I was happily sipping my hot coffee and reading the Post when a state car pulled into the marina parking lot. You know, that gray, minimally trimmed 4-door Ford sedan. This sight sharply intensified my attention. 2 gentlemen in black tailcoats got out of the car and asked the head of the pier a question. He pointed at me, and the 2 of them walked along the dock towards my boat. I got a very bad feeling. Perhaps there will still be a retaliatory strike from the army. 2 men in black walked carefully along the pier. I thought to myself, these guys don't go out often. I stepped towards them as they approached my pier and asked warily, "How can I help you, gentlemen?" The eldest of them showed a certificate that stated that he was an inspector in the police detachment at Fort Meade. He said in a neutral tone, "We need to talk to you, sir." I gestured to the benches on the deck of my boat and said, How about here? Or do you want to do it inside? The person who introduced himself said, "It's better inside." I led them along the ladder and into the inside of the boat. They looked in admiration at all the wood and brass parts. I asked, "Coffee?" And they both nodded in agreement. I poured 3 mugs and sat down on the bench opposite where they sat. I said, "Is it because of the army?" My dismissal may have been a little abrupt, but it was honorable. I can't believe there could be a problem with this now. Both looked at each other. The older one said, "The question concerns your wife, sir." That was the last thing I wanted to hear. I was already in conflict. I didn't need a federal agency involved in my divorce. I said with bitterness, because the injustice of it all had been gnawing at me for a long time. "I don't want to talk to her yet, and in general, why should you interfere in personal affairs?" The speaker said a little too firmly, "I need you to listen to me carefully, sir." Then he paused, collected his thoughts, and continued in a neutral tone. "I'm very sorry to tell you this, but your wife Rebecca has died." I just stared at him, thinking about that puzzling word. "Dead? What do you mean, not alive?" This can't be true. God couldn't let all that vitality, intelligence, and good humor go to waste. I said in confusion, "Did you just say that my wife died? How can this be? It just doesn't fit in my head." The guy said softly, "Your wife was flying on an Army C-37 plane that was supposed to refuel at Decimomana in Sardinia. We don't know what happened, but it disappeared from Seville's air surveillance radar somewhere east of Mallorca. It was night, and the weather in the area was very bad. But we don't have an exact explanation. We may never get it." I sat silently with my mouth open and looked at them. We all like to think that we are in control of our lives, until something comes and shows us how infinitely small and fleeting our moment is. Becca's death completely annulled my existence. I stared blankly into space. Everything inside me was pounding furiously. Becca's cheating hurt me, and I thought I might not be able to stay married to her. This remained to be seen, but it never occurred to me that in the future, she would not be part of my world. This thought was too heavy for me. The second guy said quietly, "I am Father William, from the Chaplain Corps, if you want to be free of your burden, my son." I looked at him, still not understanding anything, and said with a painful howl, "Why?" I knew why. He knew why. Shit happens and no one is special. But this did not make the pain any less. Now I was completely alone and completely devastated. It scared me to death. My life, in fact, my entire reality, changed in a month. 30 days before, I was content and happy with a woman who was absolutely my soulmate. Now I was a widower whose dead wife had cheated on him in a painful and public way. But wait, the roller coaster ride isn't over yet. Obviously, there could not be a funeral since the plane Becky was flying on was somewhere at the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea. Instead, we held a memorial service in the chapel at the fort. Very few people gathered. My ancestors came from Frankfurt, which is in Michigan, not Germany. She came from Old Westbury, in Nassau County. Becky was their only child. Needless to say, my wife was from a privileged class. My old man owned a hardware store. Becca's father was doing something with a lot of money in Manhattan. However, her parents were the salt of the earth, which probably explained why their daughter was such a decent and humble person. There were a lot of tears and hugs. While giving the eulogy, I tried to keep myself together, but from time to time I had to pause to rub my eyes. Damn allergies. I made no mention of my wife's remarkable IQ or her many successes in the world of mathematics. Instead, I talked about her sunny disposition, sweet personality, and love of animals. Both sets of parents were staying in Baltimore, so we held the memorial dinner at Capitol Grill. It was a little too close to my personal apocalypse for my liking. But I wasn't going to mention the reason Becky was on that plane unless it came out later through official channels. She will always be the shining light that all who celebrated her life knew her to be. I was sitting next to Becca's father, who, as I said, was a major player in the money markets. We always got along, mainly because he only saw the form and not the nerd inside. He was just keeping the conversation going when he asked me what I was planning to do now. To me, it was like asking, excluding that Mrs. Lincoln, "How did you like the play?" But we both suffered a great loss. So, instead of my usual smart answer, I respectfully answered him, "I'm now discharged from the Army, and I'm thinking of doing what I've been working on for the last dozen years on a commercial basis." He seemed slightly interested, asking, "And what is it?" I talked about my little device and how I thought it could change the world. Maybe I sounded too enthusiastic and weirdly technical, but he caught the part that said it could be paired with almost any other device to give it a human appearance. He said, "Let me sum it up. Do you have a computer program that can make everyday things behave as if they were alive?" This was not entirely true, but close enough. I said, "Essentially, it allows another device to do something based on what it sees and learns, just like a human would do. For example, your refrigerator will know to reorder milk before it runs out, or your TV will be able to turn on your favorite show without having to use the remote." He said, "It's a nice everyday thing, like Alexa or Siri, but I don't see how it will change the world." I said, "How about installing it in a network so it can reliably identify and deal with an intruder in real time without human intervention? Or installing it in a production robot where the device could improve the job it does, or in a rocket, capable of reaching a target as if it were controlled by a person?" He looked at me in surprise and asked, "Can your invention do this?" I laughed. "It learns and does the same thing as the person performing the task. At the same time, it does everything at machine speed, does not get tired, does not make mistakes, and does not forget." He looked at me shrewdly and said, "How do you plan to bring it to market?" I laughed again and said, "I know everything there is to know about artificial intelligence, but I know nothing about marketing. How would you advise me to approach this?" He said mysteriously, "Why don't you talk to some of my people and maybe we can come up with some ideas?" Baker's father turned out to be a man of action. A guy named Philip contacted me early Monday morning, and by Tuesday I was on the Acela train for the 3-hour ride into Manhattan. The meeting took place in one of those canyon buildings on Wall Street. Philip was a frighteningly young fellow, about my age, and clearly a prominent figure in Becca's father's company. He led me into a room with a lot of glass windows and a long table. There were 4 others whose names I didn't remember, only their roles. Most of them were marketers, and one was a nerd. He and I were the only ones not wearing dark blue suits with the obligatory red tie. I sat nervously in the back of the room. Philip came forward and said, "Eric is Rebecca Spencer's ex-husband. He spoke to her father at her funeral and mentioned that he had a device that could make ordinary things learn. So he asked him to come up here so we could explain and evaluate it. Isn't that right, Eric?" I looked out the window in surprise at a helicopter flying at about the same altitude at which I was sitting, and therefore missed his words. I realized it was time to speak only when I noticed a significant pause, and that everyone was staring at me. I asked, puzzled, "What did you just say, Philip?" He pretended to be patient, as if he were talking to a second grader, and said, "I told our Tiger team that you have a device that reflects human thinking." I said carefully, "I headed the Cyber Operations Division at Fort Meade, where I created an AI that heuristically monitors networks for intrusions. In my free time, as a hobby, I expanded it to mirror general human cognition. It can be connected to most digital devices to give them basic thinking and learning abilities that are essentially human-like." The whole table looked at me as if they thought I was deceiving them. I spent the rest of the day proving that this was not the case. By the end of the meeting, the entire group, especially their house botanist, was jumping up and down with anticipation. By this time, it was already dark. Philip said, "We want to discuss this among the team members, and we will be able to finalize the proposal by tomorrow. Why don't we grab something to eat and we can put you up for the night? It was certainly better than returning to my lonely home." Besides, I had nothing to do, so I said, "Certainly." Philip and a botanist named Bobby took me to the Eurostar on the East River and checked me in. Then we were taken to Harry's Steakhouse in Hanover Square for a casual business dinner for $500. It was obvious that the plan was to get me one-on-one with Bobby and C if I really knew my stuff. So we drank a couple of bottles of excellent Cabernet and talked. This conversation apparently answered all of Bobby's concerns, because around 10 o'clock that evening, Philip, apparently using Dad's credit card, suggested we end the evening at Flash Dancers on Murray. Winking at me. I had no idea what that meant, and I don't think Bobby either. We were both nerds, and nerds don't know anything about smelly clubs. But Philip, of course, knew. He walked confidently inside, and Bobby and I hid behind him, looking around as if we were afraid that someone would recognize us. I must admit that this is a stylish establishment. The decor is high class, like in an expensive gentleman's establishment. The gorgeous waitresses are all wearing masks, according to New York rules, and not much else. If you didn't pay attention to the loud music and two super fit girls performing very difficult exercises on poles at the end of the hall, you might not have guessed that this was a strip club. There were several reasons why I didn't want to be there. First of all, nerds are too damn shy to enjoy being surrounded by mostly naked women plying their trade next to you like it's a Denny's restaurant. But more importantly, I was still not even close to recovering from Becca's betrayal and death, and the atmosphere of this place raised a million annoying and unresolved questions. So I sat there for no more than 5 minutes, when the carnal madness going on around me and the implicit sinful atmosphere just overwhelmed me, and I began to sob. It was too much. And it was also the single most shameful and humiliating moment in my life. Bobby, who suffered from the same social disadvantages as me, reacted as if I had vomited on the table. Philip looked at me with some contempt, but mostly it was irritation, because I was interfering with his progress with the waitress. He asked Bobby, should I take him back to the hotel? As we sat in the taxi, I told my new friend my sad story. Bobby was like me, so I was absolutely sure that the last thing he wanted to hear about was any aspect of my personal life, but I just had to explain myself. He muttered something like, I understand, but I knew that wasn't true. It would take walking a mile in my shoes to understand how damaged my current psychological landscape was. In fact, I was close to deciding that there was no point in living anymore. Then, the next day, the roller coaster took me one more turn. The gist of our conversation was that whoever Becca's father represented wanted my little invention and was willing to pay for it. The amount they were willing to pay was unbelievable. So I had one last meeting with my ex-father-in-law before I boarded the Acela train at Penn Station. He had a conversation corner filled with expensive leather furniture in an office that was slightly larger than my small home. It was difficult to relax. But I was a stranger in a strange land, and I needed someone to rely on. His daughter was a decent person. I expected him to be like that too. I asked him, no, more like begged him, to help me. I said I was grieving so much that I couldn't think straight. Besides, I'm a nerd, not a businessman. I don't have the slightest idea how to act wisely. He looked at me in such a way that I realized that I had finally found a common language with him. He loved his daughter. Obviously, I loved her too. He said, don't worry, Eric. You are still part of the family. I'll handle this for you if you trust me enough to give me power of attorney. You can just live your life and try to make sense of what happened. This conversation became the next radical turning point in my life. Becca's father was like a father to me. He called a month later to say that my little invention had been bought by a big player for 9 figures, and that coupled with licensing income had made me rich beyond my wildest dreams. It's always like this in technology. Amazon, Facebook, Microsoft, even SpaceX all started with a nerd and a good idea. Then, a decade later, they were led by packs of plutocrats in a dastardly competition to become the richest man in the world. In my case, the only question for Mr. Spencer was, will you do this for me? I was serious. What did I know about money? So, plunged into the abyss of despair, I soared to the heights of great wealth. All this lasted from mid-December to early March. In just 3 months, I went from an ordinary person to a nerd with unlimited wealth. It was a completely unimaginable turn, as if I had won the lottery. The change in circumstances was justifiably upsetting. You must understand. I worked on my gadget out of simple intellectual curiosity. Botanists are like that. We don't think about money or even need it. Now I was rich beyond belief. It took a lot of midnight thinking to figure out what it was. The strong change in mental temperature almost broke me. The irony was that money was now a cruel joke. After all, what could I spend it on? The only thing of real value is gone forever. And botanists, like the wolf, the swan, and the humble seahorse, mate for life. 3 years have passed. During this time, the only significant change was that I sold our house and moved from the USA. I had to do it to keep my sanity. I knew I would commit suicide if I didn't get away from everything that reminded me of Becky. At least the money allowed me to do it. The goal was to separate my old life from my new circumstances as much as possible. Sort of like a factory reset. I wanted to clear my mind of any reminders of my love. I did some research called Where You Can Go Away from the Ring Road and ended up in Port Isaac on the Cornish coast. It could just as easily have been any other remote place. But I half understood the native language there. Port Isaac is a neat fishing village with a rural feel where I could sit and contemplate the ocean and try to heal. When I arrived, at first I was just as depressed as at home. But the amazingly simple people, their life in the pub, and the friends I made there helped me get out of it. However, Port Isaac is on the Atlantic side of the Cornish Peninsula. Therefore, the weather there is the same as in Ireland, that is, a lot of rain. I really enjoyed the social atmosphere of the place, but 3 years later, the gray days made my depression worse. I understood that it was the height of hypocrisy to continue to play Hamlet when fortune smiled at me so openly generously. Now I had all the time in the world and an endless amount of money, and I thought I could move to the sun-drenched Mediterranean. I think you understand why I wanted to go there. Firstly, it was always sunny and hot there. But more importantly, my wife lay lost in the depths of the sea somewhere east of Mallorca. This is the place where I was drawn. For this, I bought Hylas 44. Its body was royal blue rather than the traditional white because I like the solid look the color gives. The upper decks and planking were white or mahogany, and the aluminum mast gleamed in the sun. Hylas is a single-masted cruiser with boat rigging. The fit-out and fittings are all ultra-high class, and the luxury of wood and brass below deck is a true tour de force. There is a gallery lounge with exceptional living space and a true stateroom. This is not easy for a solo traveler, but I wasn't worried about not being able to handle her. The Hylas was only a couple of meters longer than my old packet, and in this class, I was an expert. The sails were controlled by roller furlers, which took all the weight, and I had an autopilot. But tuning a boat correctly requires skill and a keen eye. After I added all the navigation equipment, generator, air conditioning, and propulsion for the sails, the yacht cost over $1 million. But if I'm alone, I'll need all this for safety. On a hot sunny day, I picked up the yacht from the Yacht Marine office in Barcelona's Marina Port Vell. I completed all the paperwork at the embankment with my new girlfriend. We met when I was in England. She was slender and gorgeous, with huge green eyes and an arrogant personality that reeked of grandeur. At first, she acted aloof, but I was patient with her, and now she was completely devoted to me. She walked around our new house, looking at everything with contempt. Then she made a lightning movement and reappeared with a mouse in her mouth, which was quite appropriate since Bastet is a cat. Well, actually, technically she's not a cat. She belongs to an older breed of cat called Mao, from Egyptian cat. Mao are descendants of African wildcats. It is these creatures that are found in ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. She is slightly larger than a house cat and has a strange spotted coat that suggests her origins are closer to the cheetah. I love dogs. They are always your friends. But dogs on boats have a hygiene problem. There is no such problem with cats, and as a bonus, cats get rid of unwanted stowaways. I named her Bastet after the Egyptian goddess of war. It's a fitting name as she is a wild little creature who seems to view our relationship as a hunting partnership rather than a master and pet one. Bastet and I talk a lot. She's Egyptian, so she has an exotic accent. But when I get sentimental, she's not afraid to tell the truth. He looks at me with his ancient eyes and hisses, "I cannot hunt with such a weak companion. You must be better, my brother." Maybe I'm just talking to myself. But Bastet speaks very wisely. I left Barcelona Harbor on a sunny July day, heading south-southeast using the satellite navigation's built-in autonomous steering. I was aiming for the Balearic Islands because that was the area where Becca's plane crashed. I was hoping to find out something more about it there. Too pretentious, I suppose. I just wanted to be near the place of her death. I was haunted by the thought of her last minutes of horror when the plane was falling. Plus, I needed a short route to identify all the problems with my brand new boat. Sailboats are like women. You need to know their quirks if you want to have a good marriage. My destination was the city of Palma on the island of Mallorca. It is the largest of the Balearic Islands, approximately 120 miles from Barcelona Harbor. I was on port tack and sailing into a strong westerly wind with full mainsail and staysail, making almost 9 knots. You don't experience such sensations on any other type of transport, except, perhaps, a motorcycle. The island has impressive mountains on its northern side, and by late evening, it began to emerge from the haze on the southeastern horizon. Just before sunset, I rounded the western tip of the island and dropped anchor in the marina of Palma, 14 hours after setting sail. Hylas and I fell in love with each other. The night was beautiful, with a soft, magical breeze and the sounds of the small town of Palma in the background. At 9 o'clock in places like Spain, it's dinner time, and I've seen herds of tourists milling around the city. Memories of the only person I cared about came flooding back to me, and I began to grieve for the millionth time. Bastet lay on the combing of the companionway hatch and looked at me the way cats do. She is a fierce little beast, and there is no peace in her wild soul. She hissed contemptuously, "You need to stop thinking about the past, brother. This is weakness. Strong hunters only think about their next kill." Of course, she was right. Everyone wants to see themselves as strong and effective. This is a matter of personal pride, and I have been out of my mind for a long time. I couldn't continue to behave this way and retain any dignity or self-respect. Therefore, I decided to speak out against it right here and now. The fact is that it is impossible to change the past. You can only do your best in the present. In an incredibly short period of time, I experienced a series of powerful blows. From the seduction of my wife, her subsequent death, and then the ridiculous changes in my personal situation. It broke my inner gyroscope. I had no peace of mind. Now I was determined to turn things around and enjoy my newfound status as a fabulously wealthy man. This was to begin the next morning. I sat on the deck with a Cuban cigar, a habit I picked up once I got used to a limitless supply of cash and Googled 5-star hotels. I woke up to a bright and hot July day. I booked a suite at the Palacio Can Marquez, which was about a 10-minute walk from where I docked. This hotel was considered the best in Mallorca. I asked 6T to deliver a BMW 8 Series convertible to the hotel, but I wanted to get there on foot from the yacht. Therefore, I strolled through the honeyed streets of the old town of Palma, enjoying the atmosphere. I was dragging a suitcase on rollers. A large spotted cat was prowling next to me. Baste insists on walking next to me. She thinks we're looking for prey, which, in a way, we probably were. People tried hard not to stare. Bastet hissed, "What's the matter with these people? Maybe I should kill someone so they don't look at us." She didn't say it out loud, but I knew that was what she was thinking. Bastet doesn't actually know that he only weighs 11 kilograms. The receptionist didn't bat an eyelid when Bastet came in with me. He might have said something if I was renting a room for less than $800 a night. But the staff at the Palacio Hotel are accustomed to the whims of their wealthy clients. The room was decorated in dark wood, cream plaster, and immaculate tiles, overlooking the busy Carrer de la Punta d'Ors street below. Bastet looked around the room with her usual condescension and found it moderately pleasant. Then she climbed out onto the balcony and lay there with her tail between her legs, looking like a jaguar in a tree. I told her, "No falling on unsuspecting passers-by." I was joking. The street was about 14 meters away, but Bastille looked at me with her typical green-eyed gaze and said, "It all depends on how tasty they look." I think she really believed it. I laughed, then closed the door and went downstairs to have lunch in the hotel courtyard. The mashed avocado and egg toast were exactly as delicious as I imagined, and the cold San Miguel was refreshing. I was idly thinking about my life and the future when I began to experience a strange sensation. It was an ominous rumble, like an eerie increase in wind before a rapidly approaching thunderstorm. I looked around for the cause, and it hit me like a tornado hits a trailer park in Topeka. My wife Rebecca just came out onto the terrace. Of course she was dead. Can you imagine the parade of emotions running through my mind? At first there was a slight realization, I know this woman. Then, complete disbelief when I realized where I knew her. Then came a stunned feeling of the complete unreality of what was happening. Okay, then, tell me, how would you react? I finally accepted that the love of my life was gone forever and committed myself to building my life without her. And then, just at the moment when I decided to do this, God takes away the soccer ball. I was already starting to get tired of all these ups and downs. You might think I was sane for the next few minutes. If so, then you are very mistaken. In fact, I was convinced that I was crazy. Think about it. You would assess the situation calmly, or you would be in a mortal blockade because your eyes were telling you something that your cerebral cortex judged to be untrue. In about 30 seconds, I went through 4 of the 5 stages of grief. At first, there was denial. You're an idiot. That's not her. This led to anger. Damn it! This is some cruel trick. Then came the bargaining. I'll live better if it's her. This was followed by depression. This just makes me so sad. There was no talk of acceptance. Oddly enough, the first thing that came to my mind was the improbability of the circumstances. I mean, to quote one guy in a bar in Casablanca, not far from where I was sitting, of all the gins in the world. But there were bigger questions, like why Rebecca was still alive and why she doesn't recognize me. So, as you can imagine, I felt a lot of emotions. Continued in the next video. Subscribe to the channel and click on the bell so you don't miss the second final part. The link to the second part will be in the description of this video below. Subscribe to our channel so that your second chaff doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think about listening to the next one.